Chapter 2 Trouble Comes Double. Venus had been the first planet colonized. The first explorers to penetrate its eternal cloud envelope had found, to everyone's surprise, a breathable atmosphere. This had been hidden from the spectroscopes of Earth's astronomers by the peculiar constitution of that cloud envelope which hid Venus's surface from the observation of Earth. The colonization of Mars had not been possible until almost a century later. There had been only experimental outposts there, under domes, until the technology of the late 21st century had provided the means of creating an artificial atmosphere. This was done by concentrating what oxygen there was in a narrow band close to the surface instead of letting it diffuse itself through the entire depth of atmosphere. Held close to the ground, it made Mars habitable except for mountainous or plateau areas. By that time, constant travel between Earth and Venus had caused interplanetary travel to develop to the point where it was easy and inexpensive, and the colonization of Mars had been very rapid. It had been a spontaneous emigration of the common people that had caused Mars, for a while, to suffer from a lack of trained scientists and statesmen, a lack of qualified leadership. Men who had achieved success and eminence on Earth did not care to emigrate. That's where the Kingston duplicator had come in. It had seemed to be a perfect answer to Mars's problems. It had enabled men like Duclos, Kingston himself, Barry, Wade, and hundreds of others, the men who had contributed most to the science and political leadership of Earth, to remain at home on Earth and to have duplicates of themselves sent to Mars. The Duplies were to contribute to the advancement of Mars what their originals had contributed and were contributing to the advancement of Earth. There was a catch, but nobody knew about it until too late. The Kingston duplicator had been invented early in the 22nd century. One duplicator, adjustable either as transmitter or receiver, could send to another, at either close range or interplanetary distances, a duplicate of any object placed in the field of the transmitting machine. It did not involve, of course, any creation of matter. The receiving machine drew upon a hopper of anything at all, usually sand, which was transmuted electronically into whatever elements were needed for creation of the duplicate. With respect to inanimate objects, the Kingston duplicator had only one theoretical limitation, one that was learned the hard way. Fissionable material, even in less than critical quantities, could not be transmitted duplicated without exploding in the sending machine. The duplicator had, of course, changed the economy of Earth and of Venus and Mars, but not completely, not too greatly. The tremendous amount of power it required prevented its practical use for the reproduction of anything except expensive and valuable things. Of what benefit to reproduce a bushel of wheat or a chair at a cost of $1,000 worth of power when you can grow the wheat or make the chair much more cheaply? On the other hand, a $5,000 mink coat becomes less of a luxury item when it can be duplicated for a fifth of that sum. Small precision instruments, very valuable relative to weight, became cheaper in duplication. Rare metals and elements, except the fissionable ones, became less prohibitively expensive, and thereby opened new fields to technology. The government had made one restriction to protect the investment of those who had money invested in precious stones. Diamonds, except those necessary for industrial use, were restricted. So were human beings. Early experiments with lesser animals had shown that duplication of them was quite possible without apparent harm to the animals, and also without commercial possibilities, since it remained cheaper to raise a pig than to duplicate it. But before a single human being had been duplicated by a Kingston duplicator, governments, acting in concert, ruled against the attempt. If for no other reason, there would be too many legal difficulties involved in the duplication of a human being. a wife could find herself with duplicate identical husbands, a job or a bank account or an insurance policy would find itself with duplicate identical claimants. And which was the original, and what would be the rights of the duplicate? And besides, there was no logical reason for permitting the duplication of a human being. Until the lack of technicians and leaders in the new Martian colonies suggested an advantage to human duplication that seemed, if proper restrictions were observed, the perfect answer to the problem. Suppose Duplie, top electronics engineer of Earth, and electronics engineers were badly needed on Mars, agreed to have a duplicate of himself created on and for Mars. Duplie had nothing to lose, except that he signed a paper agreeing never to leave Earth, which he had no desire to do anyway. His duplicate would be required to agree never to leave Mars. The Martian government would give the Duplie an amount of money equal to whatever the original possessed. Only men with no close family ties could be chosen. As long as they remained as far apart as Earth and Mars, there could be no conflict of personal interests between them. It seemed foolproof, and the experiment was permitted. Duplie was duplicated. His Duplie took over electronics development on Mars and voiced no objection to his lot. Wade, top man in interplanetary economics, Kingston, inventor of the duplicator, acquired a duplicate on Mars. Several hundred others, top men in every other important field. Then the catch, the unsuspected missing ingredient. The first of the Duplies had concealed, cleverly, their essential non-humanness, their plans, until the quota had been filled. Then, all of them, starting with those in positions of power at the top, they had taken over Mars, and few of the human people of Mars knew or even suspected that they had been taken over. There were top statesmen, top propagandists among the Duplies. And now Mars was at war with Earth, a peculiar war. Strapped in the chair, Matt Anders suddenly realized that he should have fought his captors even without chance of winning, on the off chance that he might have been killed in the struggle. Until this moment he hadn't realized how much better it would have been to die rather than to be duplicated on Mars. For his duplicate would, at least after indoctrination, be on their side, and his duplicate would know every political and military secret of Earth known to him. Matt Anders, right-hand man, Hatchetman extraordinary of Dwight Morphy, president of the Council of Nations of Earth. The top secrets, just about all of them, of Terran policy and planning. It wasn't only his ability, valuable as that alone would be to them, that they were duplicating, it was his knowledge. The instant he realized that, he would have rushed to commit suicide had there been any possible way for him to do so before they threw the switch. For a second, blinding light played around him, but he felt nothing, except for the slight temporary pain in his eyes from the light, and that could have been avoided by a blindfold. Duplication was painless, without sensation. Then the sudden after-effect that had been noticed in every living thing, animal or human, who had been duplicated, temporary unconsciousness that would last a few minutes. He felt himself slipping into it, and he knew, and was past caring, that in his case he'd never waken from it. Now that they'd duplicated him, they'd kill him quickly before he came out of the after-effect, before they even unstrapped him from the chair. The last thing he knew was that somebody was telling somebody else to hurry, damn it, hurry, and then the blackness and the blankness came. Someone was shaking his shoulder gently. Someone was saying, "Are you hurt badly? Was it a hit-and-run car? Should I call an ambulance?" Matt Anders sat up groggily. He was at the point along the street where he had been attacked. He looked about him. His hat was lying in the gutter, and his briefcase was where he had dropped it during the brief struggle. The land cab wasn't in sight. There wasn't any evidence at all that he'd been kidnapped and then returned to the same spot where the assault had occurred. and they thought he'd been unconscious since that first blow with the blackjack. He wasn't supposed to know anything besides the assault had happened. He wasn't supposed to know that he'd been duplicated. And he hadn't any proof, except his own word, that he had been. The Venusian authorities would tell him his story was fantastic, and it would sound that way. It was fantastic that there could be an illegal private duplicator operated by Duplies here in orderly and peaceful New Albuquerque. He himself could hardly believe what had happened. The Venusian authorities would accuse him of lying in order to create an interplanetary episode. "Are you all right?" somebody said. "Shall I call an ambulance?" He put his hand to the back of his head as he turned to look up. The man standing behind him was small, mild, inoffensive, a typical clerk or bookkeeper from one of the government offices. "I'm all right," Anders said. "I'll be all right in a minute. Just a sore noggin from a sap." "A sap? Oh, you mean a blunt weapon. Were you attacked and robbed?" Had they been that thorough? He put his hand into the pocket where he'd carried his money. It was gone. They'd been thorough enough to make it look like an assault and robbery. Not that the money mattered. Once he was out of his disguise, his signature was good for any reasonable amount at any Venusian bank, but the valuable information in his briefcase? No, they wouldn't have bothered tampering with that. The papers in the secret compartment were valuable only for the information on them, and that information was in his head as well. It would also be in the head of his Duplie on Mars. He got to his feet a little shakily and found that he was all right, except for the ache in the back of his head and the dustiness of his clothes. He said, "I'm all right, thanks." "You're sure? You're sure you don't want—" "I'm sure," Anders said. "Thanks a lot, but I'm sure. I've got only a block to go, and I'll report this to the police from there." He knew it would seem strange to the little clerk if he didn't intend to report it. He got his hat and briefcase and started off, a bit waveringly at first, but more firmly after he'd gone a few steps. After one try at putting the hat back on his head, he carried it in his hand. His head would be too sore for days to let him wear a hat. He grinned wryly as it came to him that his duplicate on Mars would have an equivalently sore head. The blow of the blackjack had fallen before the duplication. He was less than 15 minutes late when he arrived at Ambassador Pearson's residence. He stopped outside the door long enough to brush most of the dust from his clothes and then rang the bell. Pearson himself came to open the door. He looked blankly until Anders said, "Matt Anders, Mr. Ambassador, please overlook the disguise, at least until I have a chance to remove it." "Anders, but—" Pearson looked down at Anders' clothes. "What on earth happened? Did you have an accident?" His eyes widened. "Or are you Matt Anders? That disguise—" Anders grinned. "Is a good one, but if you'll suspend disbelief long enough to give me access to a lavatory for a few minutes, I think you'll recognize me. And after that, I'll tell you what happened." "Certainly. And while you're there, can I make you a drink? You look as though you could use one. Something Venusian, or—" "Whiskey," Anders said. "A big slug of it, straight, wouldn't hurt me a bit." Pearson showed him a door. "That room will do, and your drink will be waiting, Matt." In the lavatory, it took only a few minutes to remove the thin rubber mask, backed by sponge rubber in places, to change the shape of his features, and to remove the gray wig that had helped cut down the force of the blackjack blow. There was a clothes brush, and it removed the rest of the street dirt from his coat and trousers. He looked at himself in the glass, and the face that looked back at him was a familiar one. A thin, angular face, vaguely Mephistophelian, very Mephistophelian in the many caricatures of him that had been in the newspapers of 3 planets. Not a popular face, even among people of his own planet. The face of a man reputed to wield too much power, and to wield it ruthlessly, and a man whose face, particularly in caricature, looked the part. But a handsome face, an interesting one. a face all too easy to remember, which was why he wore such careful disguises when he traveled alone. How had the Duplies penetrated that disguise? His best friend, and that was probably President Morphy, couldn't have done so. His drink and a comfortable chair were waiting for him when he rejoined Pearson. He sank into the chair and drank deeply and appreciatively. Then he put down his glass and said, "Mr. Ambassador, I believe I've learned the secret of the disasters we've had recently. I believe I know how the Duplies have been getting their information." He frowned, and it's about time, if it isn't too late. It shouldn't be any secret that our morale has been on the skids for months. At this rate, in spite of the fact that we control space and have the Duplies pretty solidly blockaded, we'll lose the war due to apathy on Earth. Corruption, bribery, inability, let's face it, among our top military leaders. Our munitions industry breaking down from the top. Our diplomats losing points in negotiations with Venus to come in on our side. The ambassador winced at the last sentence. "That's rather a blow under the belt, isn't it, Matt? I've done my best." "Sure, but you're bucking espionage beyond anything you've ever dreamed of. That's what I found out today. Mars knows already every detail of the information and instructions I've brought you, and I haven't even turned them over to you yet." "Good God, Matt, are you sure? How?" Anders told him, briefly, the experience he'd just had, and wasn't supposed to remember. Pearson's face was a pattern of dismay when he'd finished. He thought, and then asked, "But why didn't they kill you? I don't understand that. Duplicated on Mars or not, you're still a valuable man to Earth." "Two reasons, sir. First, the information they'll get from my duplicate will be more valuable to them if, as they think, we don't know they have it. If I disappeared, or were found dead under whatever circumstances, there'd be at least a suspicion that they had the information I was carrying, a copy of it, even though the original was still in my briefcase. Second, what if they plan later to get my Duplie to Earth through the blockade, and they do get ships through it, either way, and then have me killed under circumstances where he can step into my shoes?" He leaned forward earnestly, and if that's happened already to some of our top men, it explains a lot, a hell of a lot. "But if that's true—" There was a knock on the door, a soft tap. Pearson frowned. "Must be my daughter. Well, I won't let her interrupt us long." He raised his voice. "Come in." The door opened, and the girl who came through it was, Matt Anders thought, possibly the most striking girl he'd ever seen. There was something about the way she held herself, the way she walked. He remembered now having heard that Ambassador Pearson had a great-grandparent who had been a full-blooded Sioux. It was obvious in his daughter. Her cheekbones were high, her complexion dark, her hair raven black and worn in braids across the top of her head. Tall, lithe, full-breasted, calm-eyed, she carried herself with the pride and dignity of the Plains Indian. And although she was young, possibly 10 years Anders' junior, she had the poise and assurance of a woman who has been conscious of her beauty for years. Matt Anders was on his feet before Pearson's murmured introduction. He swallowed and immediately felt ridiculous at the reaction. But almost all the women he'd ever met had seemed weak and insipid to him. Marta Pearson was something else again. She was almost an atavism. She was as different from the modern woman of the 22nd century as a tiger from its descendant, a tabby cat. And maybe that accounted, Anders thought, for his reaction. He had often suspected that he himself, emotionally, belonged in a different and earlier century. She smiled distantly in acknowledgment of the introduction, but her smile didn't reach beyond her lips as she held out a cool hand to him, and her words were to her father. I recognized Matt Anders immediately, Father. After all, one can hardly look at a periodical or tune in a visor without seeing the features of the famous alter ego of President Morphy. His Hatchetman, I believe, is the commoner term. Her father said sharply, "Marta!" Matt Anders felt himself blush, the first time he'd done so, to his own recollection, since adolescence. But he made his voice calm. "It isn't always easy to serve your planet in the way your superiors direct, Miss Pearson, especially when your position isn't an elective one from which you can be removed for unpopularity." He hesitated for a moment, then decided to continue. "Hasn't it occurred to you that, disliked as I am, President Morphy is the most respected and loved person on Earth? But if there wasn't a Matt Anders, a Hatchetman, to do certain things for him, perhaps he could not even be re-elected. Right now, he's just about all that's holding Earth together and keeping the anti-war faction from letting the Duplies have their way on Mars." He wondered, even as he talked, why he was bothering to justify himself. He was used to being hated by millions. Why worry about one more? Except that the one more was suddenly important to him. Marta Pearson still smiled coolly. "A convincing little speech, Mr. Anders. Unfortunately, it seems difficult for me to forget that it was you who ordered the Third Fleet to take the Martian base on Calypso at all costs, and all costs turned out to be the loss of 3/4 of the fleet. Oh, they took Calypso, yes, but where were you at the time, Mr. Anders?" She had touched a raw spot. He paled, angry at her, angrier at himself for allowing her to put him on the defensive like this. "I was on Luna, Miss Pearson, when the Third Fleet left there on its mission. I did not accompany it on strict and specific orders from President Morphy. He, not I, thought I was too valuable to risk, especially since I have no training in space combat and would have been of no special value to the fleet." Her smile was openly sardonic now. "Yet you ordered them, and don't deny it was your order, to take Calypso at all costs. And they were obliged to obey that order, even when it was found the satellite's defenses were far stronger than had been guessed."
"Marta,"
her father said again. "And they took it," she went on, "with losses of 3 ships out of 4. My brother was on one of the ships that didn't make it, my fiancé on another." She turned and walked from the room.
"I'm sorry, Matt," Pearson said. "I don't know what I can say or do."
Anders grinned wryly. "You might get me another drink, Mr. Ambassador. If she waited, I could have told her my own brother happened to be with that fleet and didn't come back."
"That I can tell her, and will, Matt, and I wish top secrecy didn't prevent my telling even my own daughter the reason that order was necessary, and would have been justified, even if it had meant complete loss of several fleets."
Matt Anders took the glass Pearson held out to him. "You know that?"
"Yes, uranium on Calypso, none on Mars, which is why that base was of vital importance to the Duplies, and why it was equally vital to us to keep them away from it if they once get quantities of uranium."
Anders nodded gloomily. "If they do, then the war is no longer in space only. We'll have to destroy their cities to keep them from destroying ours, and it will end up with both being destroyed. As long as there's even a chance of the stalemates continuing, anything would be better than that." He flicked his hand in a characteristic gesture, brushing the subject aside. He downed his second drink before he picked up his briefcase and took papers from the secret compartment, which he handed to the ambassador. "Well, here's what I was to deliver to you, sir, and now it's delivered. Only, and keep this between us, work on the certainty that the Duplies have this information too. at least the general outlines of it. If I'd been able to memorize all the minor details and figures, of course, I wouldn't have carried the papers. But my Duplie will know all I knew about it, and that's enough to make it practically worthless.
Pearson looked puzzled. But you said between us. You mean you're not going to report what happened to you?
Not while I'm on Venus. I'm not going to stay here long anyway, just long enough, in fact, to get a night's sleep tonight. I'll leave in the morning, and what I've learned through my own kidnapping and duplication is so important, I want to report it in person, direct to Morphy. I won't even trust the tight beam. We're not sure the Duplies aren't tapping it.
I see, Matt. Probably you're right, and I'm awfully sorry about Marta.
It could have been worse. At least she didn't take a shot at me, and that's happened 3 times in 3 months back on Earth. Misguided people, and they weren't all Duplies either, seemed to think killing me would solve all the problems of the solar system.
Well, I'll talk to her before dinner. By the way, Matt, one thing I've wondered about, not that it matters, did you give that order to the Third Fleet, or did you just transmit the President's order?
Oh, I gave it all right. It became a sudden emergency when we learned about the uranium angle on Calypso, and I couldn't reach Morphy immediately, so I gave the order. Later, of course, he confirmed it, but the publicity went to my issuance of the order, not his confirmation of it. He shrugged. Well, that's part of my job, to take the blame for nasty things off his shoulders. And that was a particularly nasty one from the outside, because we had to hold back, for security reasons, why Calypso was suddenly so vitally important.
Pearson nodded slowly. I begin to see how tough a job you've got. Wish I could tell that to Marta. Suppose I can tell her that it was of vital importance, even if I don't tell her why, and that you lost your brother there, too.
Anders said, Don't please. It's part of my job to have people feel like that about me. But he knew, even as he said it, that he didn't want Marta Pearson to feel that way. The girl attracted him as no woman ever had before. The ambassador cleared his throat.
Just the same, I'm going to talk to her. By the way, we dine early on Venus. If you wish, before dinner, to be shown to your room to bathe and... You didn't bring any luggage, so I presume you won't have to change.
The bath sounds good to me, but haven't you heard of wash-techs? I can wash these right under the shower with me, and they'll dry in the original folds in 3 minutes. Luggage will be a thing of the past when these become common, unless one's taking a long enough trip to want variety in costume.
Good. Then I'll show you too.
Wait, Mr. Ambassador. If we can spare a few minutes, I've just got an idea. Let me think it out a second first.
Anders had stood up. Now he sat down again in his chair, and the ambassador sat down again too. After a few seconds, Anders said,
I think it's a good idea. Listen, I know how we can put a crimp in whatever plans the Duplies may have for substituting my Duplie for me somewhere. They can't know how badly I was injured by that blackjack. They didn't have time to give me a medical examination. Suppose you put out a general story, give it to the newscast services, that shortly after my arrival here, I died of a brain concussion. The Duplies will believe it.
But, good Lord, Matt!
Let me finish. You also send a type beam message to Morphy telling him that the newscast story is a phony, that I'll report to him as soon as possible and explain it, for him to arrange so I can land safely in the same disguise and under the same name I use coming here, without being shot as a Duplie of myself. The Duplies know that disguise, but if they think I'm dead, they won't be watching for me.
But you yourself said we're not absolutely sure they don't intercept our tight beam. What if they do?
Anders' hand flipped the possibility aside. Nothing certain. If they do intercept it, we've lost nothing. If they don't, we're a jump up on them. He grinned. And we can always announce that the report of my death was exaggerated. Much of that will disappoint many people. You'll do it?
Of course, Matt.
Let's see. Earth time. Morphy won't be getting up for a couple of hours yet. Get the tele-news story out right away, if you will, but hold off until after dinner on the tight beam correction. No use waking him up. His health's not been too good lately, and he's been working much too long hours. Besides, he thought to himself, it wouldn't hurt Morphy to think for a few hours, if he got the tele-news story first, that he lost himself a messenger boy. It might give him something to think about before the secret correction came.
If you want it that way, Matt.
I do. And now, if I could go to my room.